It was on a late autumn evening, the kind where the wind whispers secrets to the trees, that I stumbled upon a truth I never thought I would face. The golden hues of the setting sun cast long shadows across my living room as I sat by the fireplace, lost in the comfort of an ordinary evening. The warmth of the fire contrasted sharply with the chill I would soon feel deep within. My wife of 10 years had always been my anchor, my constant in a world of chaos. We had built a life together, filled with shared dreams and countless memories. But as the years passed, I noticed something, a subtle shift in her. She was still beautiful, still kind, but there was a distance in her eyes that no amount of love seemed to bridge. It was as if she were looking through me rather than at me. The signs were so small at first. A forgotten detail here, an odd excuse there, a lingering scent on her clothes that wasn't mine. At first I dismissed them, chalking it up to the stresses of life or my own insecurities. But the seed of doubt had been planted, and with every passing day it began to grow. One evening, as I was tidying up the study, I found it. A small, innocuous envelope wedged between the pages of an old book we'd once read together. It was sealed with care, the name of a hotel written on the front. My heart began to race. I recognized that name. It was the place we had visited on our honeymoon, a memory I had cherished, one we had often joked about returning to. I opened it with trembling hands. Inside was a receipt for a stay at that very hotel. But the date was recent, and the accompanying notes revealed a second person, a name I didn't recognize, with messages that left no room for ambiguity. The carefully worded phrases were clear, a rendezvous that lasted several days. The truth hit me like a storm, tearing through the quiet facade of my life. I could hardly breathe, my mind reeling. The evidence was irrefutable, and yet it felt unreal. How could I have missed it for so long? How had she hidden this from me? I confronted her that evening, my voice barely above a whisper. The conversation that followed was painful, each word a dagger to my heart. She tried to explain, her eyes filled with guilt and sorrow, but the truth was undeniable. 10 years of my life, spent building a future, shattered in a moment. The love I had given, the trust I had placed in her, it all seemed to vanish in the space between those few, simple words. In the aftermath, I found myself questioning everything. What had I missed? Where had I gone wrong? The hardest part was not just the betrayal, but the realization that our lives had been a lie, a carefully constructed illusion I had never suspected. The truth, once uncovered, became a weight I couldn't escape. But in that moment, I also found something else, strength. The pain was unbearable, but I knew I could rebuild. The journey ahead was uncertain, filled with loss and discovery, but it would be mine to navigate. And somewhere, hidden beneath the rubble of what had been, there was the possibility of a new beginning. That story, my story, was not the end, but a new chapter, one I would write on my own terms, O Minnie. As time passed, the wounds of that first betrayal, though raw and fresh, began to heal, slowly. The anger that had once consumed me settled into a quiet grief, and the uncertainty, while still present, was tempered by a resolve to move forward. I became a man more aware of the fragility of trust, more cautious in my interactions, yet determined to reclaim the life I had once known. But life, as it often does, has a way of testing us. It was a few years later, during a time I thought I had learned how to navigate the maze of love and loss, that the pattern repeated itself, though this time with a deeper, more insidious sense of déjà vu. Her name was Lily, the woman who entered my life after I had slowly begun to recover. She was kind, intelligent, with eyes that sparkled with a quiet mystery. She seemed to understand me in ways I hadn't thought possible, filling the space left by the one who had shattered my trust so long ago. We spoke of dreams and ambitions, shared laughter and silences, and for a while it felt as though I had found a kindred spirit. But there are times when the past refuses to remain buried. A subtle suspicion lingered like a faint breeze just before a storm. It began with small, seemingly inconsequential moments. She started coming home later than usual, her phone became an object of quiet secrecy, and her smiles, once so effortlessly warm, now carried a hidden weight. The same signs, only more refined, more deliberate this time. I had learned well from the past. My mind, though scarred, had become sharp, a kind of radar for deception. My intuition screamed at me, the subtle clues gathering in the corners of my consciousness. It wasn't just her late nights or the cryptic text messages anymore. It was the sudden disconnect, the walls that seemed to rise between us. The intimacy, once so familiar and comforting, felt distant, like a distant memory I could no longer fully recall. Then, one evening, the truth emerged, this time as undeniable as the first. I found a slip of paper, a hotel receipt, almost identical to the one from years ago. It was for a place I had never heard of, a secluded retreat tucked away in the mountains. The names on the receipt were familiar, though not in the way I had hoped. The other name was one that had crossed my mind only in passing, a man she had mentioned once or twice in the early days of our relationship. A friend, she had called him. But the receipt, along with the messages hidden in her phone, told a different story, one that cut deeper than the first. Her affair wasn't a fleeting moment of weakness. It was an ongoing deceit, crafted with as much care and calculation as the first. This was no accident, no unguarded lapse. It was deliberate. I confronted her with the evidence, and just like before, she tried to explain, to rationalize the betrayal with words that, in the end, felt hollow. Her tears, the sorrow. In her voice, none of it changed the reality that she had chosen to betray me again. It wasn't just the infidelity that stung, but the fact that she had hidden it so skillfully, had played her part in this cruel dance with such conviction. Her confession was a mix of guilt and justification, as though somehow in her mind she had convinced herself that what she had done was inevitable, that the fractures in our relationship, which I had failed to see at the time, had led to this point. But the truth was simple. She had betrayed my trust once more, and in doing so, had severed any chance of rebuilding what we once had. And so, once again, I found myself standing at the edge of an abyss, staring into the darkness that had once been our love. But this time, I did not fall. This time, I had learned from the past. The sting of the betrayal, though sharp, was familiar, and though it hurt like the deepest wound, I knew I would survive. I had before, and I would again. I chose to leave. Not because I hated her, no, I still loved her in a way, but because I had learned that love in its truest form requires respect, honesty, and loyalty. And without those, love is nothing more than a fragile illusion, one that can shatter at the slightest touch. This second betrayal, though devastating, was a turning point. It marked the end of one chapter and the beginning of another. The road ahead was uncertain, filled with pain and reflection, but it was mine to walk. The lessons of the past had shaped me, and though the scars remained, they no longer defined me. The truth, painful as it was, had given me a clarity I could never have imagined before. I had found the strength to let go, and in doing so, I had found the courage to move forward toward something new, something better. The years that followed Lily's departure were quiet, the kind of stillness that one feels when the heart has been battered enough to finally learn the art of self-preservation. I focused on rebuilding, focusing on my own healing, and learning how to trust in a world that had shown me its darker, hidden corners. The pain of betrayal, though sharp at times, had become a part of my past, a scar I carried not with shame, but with the understanding that I was stronger than I had ever known. But then came her, Sarah. She entered my life with the quiet grace of a storm cloud rolling over a still horizon. Sarah was different, or so I told myself. Her sincerity, her kindness, her patience. She understood my fears of love, of opening up again. She knew my history. In fact, we often spoke about it, about the wreckage of my past, about the scars I carried, about my inability to trust completely. She promised time and again that she would never betray that trust, that I could count on her, and for a time I did. We shared our mornings with warm coffee and laughter, our evenings with stories of the day, our nights wrapped in the soft warmth of companionship. It was a connection that seemed to carry weight, a grounding force in my life. I had begun to feel that maybe, just maybe, this time would be different. She was the one I could trust. But life, it seems, does not allow us the luxury of peace for long. It was the smallest thing at first, the first crack in the seemingly perfect surface. Sarah had become more distant, her smile less frequent, her eyes less focused when they met mine. I had learned the signs, though I had promised myself never to see them again. There was the sudden, almost ritualistic check of her phone whenever she thought I wasn't looking. The late nights at work became more frequent, her explanations more vague. The silence that followed our conversations, heavy, strained. I could feel it in the space between us, that familiar chill. But I dismissed it. I refused to let my mind wander there. But the truth has a way of creeping up on you, a shadow just out of sight, waiting to reveal itself when you least expect it, and then it did. It was a Friday evening, the air crisp with the promise of a changing season. Sarah had left for a meeting with a colleague, something she had done countless times before. But tonight was different. My instincts sharpened. My years of experience told me something wasn't right, and so, like a fool, I followed. The soft hum of my car engine was the only sound as I tailed her through the winding streets of the city, my heart pounding louder with every turn. I knew where she was going. She didn't even know I was following. I could feel my breath catch in my throat as we pulled into the same hotel, the one that had haunted my memories, the one I thought I had long ago sealed in the past. The name of the place flashed like a cruel reminder on the sign as she parked. I parked a little farther, away, heart racing as the door of her car swung open. She stepped out wearing that same look, the one she had worn countless times before. But this time it wasn't for me. The smile on her face, the way she adjusted her hair, it wasn't for me. It was for him. I didn't need to see more. I knew what was happening. I waited, knowing that this moment, like the one before, was one that would change everything. And when she emerged from the hotel, her eyes meeting mine for the briefest, most fleeting moment, there was no anger, no confrontation, just the cold realization that I had been deceived again. The second betrayal, the same painful truth, the shattering of everything I had thought was solid. She tried to explain, to justify, but the words felt like ashes. This time, her excuses were wrapped in half-truths and apologies, the same ones I had heard before. "It was a mistake," she said, her voice trembling. "I didn't mean for it to happen." But I had heard this story before. The narrative was all too familiar. I had learned painfully that when someone shows you who they are, you must believe them. And in that moment, I realized something. Trust, once broken, could never truly be rebuilt. Not in the same way. No matter how hard we tried, no matter how many times we promised to start over, the cracks remained. I had given her my heart again, and she had shattered it. Again. The decision was mine, and it was final. I walked away, not with hatred, but with something more valuable: clarity. The years had taught me that love, in its purest form, isn't about possessing or controlling, but about mutual respect and honesty. Sarah's betrayal wasn't a reflection of my worth, but a reflection of her inability to value what we had. And while the pain of betrayal lingered, this time it wasn't as sharp. It wasn't as all-consuming. The road ahead was uncertain, but I had learned one thing for certain. The years passed after Sarah. I spent that time in quiet reflection, the weight of my past hanging over me like a dark cloud I couldn't shake. I had rebuilt myself from the wreckage of love, piecing together fragments of trust, bit by bit. The scars had faded, not because the pain was gone, but because I had learned to wear them with a quiet resilience, a kind of strength that came only after repeated storms. I had told myself that I would never love again, not in the way I once had. I would be content with the quiet solitude of my own company, with friendships that didn't require the vulnerability of a romantic bond. But life, as it often does, had different plans for me. Her name was Emma. She came into my life when I least expected it, through a mutual friend, a chance meeting in a small cafe I frequented for its solitude. She was intelligent, confident, with a sharp wit that made me laugh in ways I hadn't in years. Her presence was comforting, like the steady rhythm of a heartbeat. She understood the weight of my past without needing to ask about it. We spent hours in conversation, exchanging ideas and stories, our minds intertwining in a way that felt effortless. I had sworn to myself I would never fall for someone again. But Emma, she had a way of slipping past my defenses, disarming my doubts. Slowly, imperceptibly, she became a part of my life. Her laughter filled the spaces between my thoughts. Her touch soothed the remnants of my old wounds. She spoke of love with such certainty, such conviction, that I believed, foolishly, that maybe, just maybe, I could have it again. I allowed myself to dream, to hope. We moved in together after a year. The idea of rebuilding once more, of opening my heart, filling me with both excitement and terror. I asked myself over and over whether I was doing the right thing. But with her, it felt different. She made me believe that love wasn't a trap, that it wasn't a game of manipulation or deceit. It was pure. It was simple. And for the first time in a long while, I trusted someone. Then came the late nights, the texts left unchecked, the cryptic calls, the excuses, the same subtle signs I had learned to recognize. At first, I pushed them aside, telling myself I was just being paranoid, that it was my past haunting me again. But deep down, a part of me knew the truth. It had always been there, lurking beneath the surface. One evening, after weeks of mounting suspicion, I came home early. The house was quiet, too quiet. My heart began to race as I walked through the front door. I didn't know what I was expecting, but what I found confirmed my worst fears. Her phone, left carelessly on the kitchen counter, vibrated once. The name that flashed on the screen was one I didn't recognize. Curiosity gnawed at me, and before I could stop myself, I picked it up. The messages were brief, but unmistakable. Flirtations, compliments, plans for a secret meeting. The name of a hotel I knew all too well, one I had sworn never to return to in my mind, let alone in reality. I stood there, holding the phone in my hand, feeling the world around me collapse once again. The echo of her laughter in my mind, the promises we had shared, all seemed like a cruel joke. The heart I had trusted her with, the heart I had given to her completely, was now in ruins. The quiet deceit, the lies whispered behind my back, it was all too familiar. Just like with the others, I confronted her. The look of shock on her face, the tears that followed, none of it surprised me. She tried to explain, of course. She begged for understanding, for forgiveness. She told me it was a mistake, that she never meant for things to go this far. She had been lonely, she claimed. Our connection had grown distant, she said. She had sought comfort elsewhere, a mistake that spiraled out of control. But the words, this time, carried no weight. The damage had already been done. I had seen this story before, and this time I was no longer the fool. The hardest part wasn't the confrontation, nor was it the betrayal itself. It was the quiet, haunting realization that the pattern was repeating. That despite all the lessons, despite the healing I had gone through, I was once again caught in the same web of lies. The pain of the past came rushing back, flooding me with an overwhelming sense of helplessness. But this time, I was different. This time I had learned. I didn't shout. I didn't fight. I didn't beg for answers. I simply walked away. There was no need for further words, no need for a drawn-out explanation. Her tears, her pleading, they didn't move me. The trust I had so foolishly given was gone, and with it, the relationship. I had given her the best parts of myself, and she had used them as tools to deceive me once again. I left that night, not with anger, but with something far more resolute. The understanding that my journey, my life, was mine to shape. The years I spent rebuilding, piecing together what remained of myself, had created a new version of me, wiser, sharper, a little more guarded, but undeniably stronger. I had thought that perhaps I had learned the lessons life had tried so hard to teach me. I had learned to trust again, slowly, cautiously. I believed, foolishly, that the shadows of betrayal would no longer chase me. But as the years wore on, I found myself drawn into the quiet lull of another relationship. Her name was Clara. She was intelligent, compassionate, with a sense of humor that brought me a sense of peace I hadn't known in years. She had an understanding of the world that mirrored my own. Both of us had been scarred by love, by betrayal. We shared a deep connection, one forged in the fires of past heartaches. It felt natural, as if fate had finally delivered me someone who understood the darkness I had lived through. We built a life together, quietly, away from the chaos. We laughed, we shared our stories, we found joy in the small things. A morning, coffee, a book we both loved, the touch of her hand on mine. For a time I felt safe. It wasn't perfect, but it was comfortable, and I began to believe that perhaps love wasn't the illusion I had once thought it to be. And yet, in the stillness of the days, I began to feel the shift again, the subtle distance. At first, I told myself it was just life, just the inevitable ebb and flow of time. But my instincts, those sharp, painful instincts that had never failed me, began to stir. I noticed the small things, the phone she kept just a little too close, the times she became distant after returning from certain places, the whispered conversations that ended too quickly when I entered the room. The signs were there again, creeping up from the shadows. This time, I tried to ignore them. I tried to convince myself that I was being paranoid, that I was seeing things that weren't there. I had learned not to jump to conclusions, not to fall back into the old patterns of suspicion. But as the weeks passed, the unease grew. I could feel it in the silence that began to settle between us, in the moments when she would look away too quickly, as though she feared I could see through her. It came to a head one late evening, a quiet night after dinner. I had noticed that Clara had been more distracted, her gaze distant as we sat across from each other. Her phone buzzed on the table, the screen lighting up with a message. I didn't mean to look. I really didn't. But the name on the screen caught my eye. It wasn't mine. I knew the rules. I knew better than to invade someone's privacy, to betray their trust. But this time I couldn't help it. I picked up the phone, my hands trembling, and unlocked it with the code she had never bothered to hide. The messages were brief, but they were enough to tell a story. The man's name was one I didn't recognize, but his words, his intimate, casual tone, spoke of something far beyond friendship. The hotel names, the planned meetings, the promises. Of secret nights. Everything was laid out before me clear as day. Clara had once again betrayed me. And this time, it wasn't just the betrayal of trust. It was the cruel, deliberate repetition of a pattern I had believed would never touch me again. My heart sank into my stomach as the reality of it hit me. She had been unfaithful, and the weight of the betrayal was heavier than I could have imagined. This wasn't an accident, a mistake, or a moment of weakness. It was calculated, chosen. She had knowingly crossed a line, just as the others had before her. I confronted her in that moment, my voice cold, controlled, as though I were watching someone else in the process of shattering. She denied it at first, of course. She tried to explain, to justify it, her words tumbling out in frantic apologies. But there was no use. The evidence was in front of me, the truth undeniable. Clara's tears flowed freely, her pleas for forgiveness echoing in the empty spaces between us. She spoke of feeling neglected, of needing something I couldn't give, her, of a loneliness she couldn't escape. But none of it mattered. The excuses were hollow, the apologies empty. I had heard it all before, from Sarah, from Emma, and I knew that it didn't change the simple truth. She had chosen to betray me, to deceive me in the most intimate of ways. I looked at her, standing there before me, and I felt the weight of years of heartbreak settle on my chest. It wasn't the anger that burned in me, but the deep, soul-crushing exhaustion of it all. The feeling of being duped, of once again being the fool who had believed in the promise of love only to find it shattered against the rocks of dishonesty. This time, I didn't waste words. I didn't try to understand. There was nothing to understand. I simply walked away. No shouting. No confrontation. No catharsis. I just walked out, my footsteps echoing in the quiet room, a finality in each step. I walked away, and the quiet of my own mind was the only companion I had in those first few days. The pain of betrayal had become so familiar, like a gnawing ache that wouldn't leave. It had burned into me, leaving scars in places I couldn't even touch. But in the days after Clara's departure, something shifted deep inside of me. A different feeling started to grow, like a seed planted in anger, a need for retribution, for justice, for closure in a way that didn't involve me, simply walking away. It was a dangerous thought, I knew. The path of revenge was one I had always avoided, something I never believed in. The idea of hurting someone in return, of letting the darkness of betrayal consume me, had always seemed foreign to my nature. But after everything, after Sarah, after Emma, after Clara, the idea seemed to take root, spreading its tendrils through my mind. I had been the one left holding the shattered pieces every time. I had been the one who trusted, who opened myself up only to be betrayed. And as I walked the streets in the dark of night, the thought began to consume me. Why shouldn't I make them feel the sting of their actions? Why shouldn't I show them how it felt to be the one lied to, the one betrayed? It wasn't that. I wanted to hurt them, not in the traditional sense. No, I wanted something more, something sharper, something that would leave a mark on their soul the way they had marked mine. I wanted them to experience the same helplessness, the same loss, the same overwhelming sense of betrayal that had broken me time and time again. The first step was finding out where Clara had gone, who she had turned to after our relationship ended. I knew that her world wasn't as simple as she had let on. The man from her messages, the one she had been seeing behind my back, had to be found. It wasn't about finding out who he was. It was about making them both understand that there was no hiding from the consequences of their actions. I started slowly, quietly. I contacted people she had known, friends she had kept close to her, and found out where she had gone after our breakup. The trail wasn't long to follow. She hadn't changed much of her life. She had gone back to her old apartment, a small, modest place she had kept before we moved in together. It wasn't far from where I lived. The more I learned, the more I understood the situation. Clara, like the others before her, had tried to bury the truth beneath a mountain of lies, but the lies always surface in the end. I didn't want to destroy her life. No, I wanted something far subtler, far more personal. I wanted her to feel the weight of every word she'd whispered to me, the promises, the lies, the excuses. I wanted her to know that I knew. I wanted her to feel the sting of the truth when it was laid bare in front of everyone. The next step was simple. I began to gather information, photographs, messages, all the evidence of her deceit. I didn't need to confront her immediately. I didn't need to lash out. I simply needed to show her the truth, the one she couldn't deny, the one that would break her from the inside out. Then came the moment when everything clicked into place. Clara was at a bar one evening, the kind of place she frequented with friends, where the noise of laughter and music drowned out the pain of reality. I knew the routine now. I knew her habits, her spots. I stood outside the bar, watching her, through the large windows, watching her laugh with her friends as if nothing had ever happened, as if the betrayal had never occurred. The anger inside me began to rise again, but this time, it wasn't just anger. It was something colder, something more calculating. I had made my decision. I entered the bar, stepping into the noise, the bustle of people who didn't know the weight of the story I was carrying. I found Clara easily, sitting at a corner booth with a friend, her eyes sparkling with that false confidence she always had when she thought she was safe. I didn't approach her at first. I just watched, taking in the scene, the way she had once again buried her past and replaced it with the illusion of normalcy. Then I did it. I slid into the booth across from her, my presence sudden, unannounced. Her eyes widened, her face paling as she recognized me. The air between us thickened immediately. "You've moved on quickly," I said, my voice low but steady. Her lips trembled as she tried to mask the shock, but it was clear she wasn't ready for this confrontation. "Is this what you wanted, Clara? To pretend it all didn't happen?" Her friend looked at me, confused, but Clara's eyes never left mine. She opened her mouth, the usual excuses on the tip of her tongue. But I wasn't here to listen. I was here to deliver the truth, to make her face the very thing she had been trying to escape. I slid a stack of photographs onto the table, the ones I had gathered, messages, snapshots, the moments she had shared with her new lover. The days that followed were a strange kind of silence, a stillness that seemed to settle around me like a thick fog. I had done it, laid out the truth in front of Clara, watched her squirm in the realization of what she had done. But what was truly unsettling wasn't the satisfaction of seeing her face crumble, it was the eerie emptiness that followed. I had gotten what I wanted, and yet a gnawing feeling lingered in the pit of my stomach. Revenge. True revenge was supposed to bring relief. But instead, it only brought a hollow ache. I found myself caught in a strange limbo. The anger that had driven me had faded into something colder, more impassive. Clara had been forced to confront her actions, but I had done nothing to fix what had been broken inside of me. The piece of my heart that she had shattered, the trust I had given her so freely, couldn't be restored with a mere act of exposure. The truth was out, but so what? What had I really achieved? That's when I realized I hadn't just wanted to see Clara suffer. I had wanted to see her regret what she had done to me. I wanted her to feel what I had felt, the heartbreak, the anger, the emptiness. And as I thought about it, I came to a disturbing conclusion. I wasn't done. I had allowed myself to believe that exposing her would be enough, But revenge, I knew now, wasn't as simple as shoving the truth in someone's face. It was about stripping away their comfort, their security, and showing them that their actions had consequences that reached farther than they could ever imagine. If I was going to truly find peace in this, I would have to make Clara feel the loss in a way she couldn't ignore. I began to plan, slowly, quietly. I needed leverage, information, anything I could use to shake her world in a way that would leave an imprint long after the confrontation. The key was to not be impulsive, to not give in to the raw, visceral urges that had led me to expose her in the first place. No, this would be precise, it would be calculated, and it would be irreversible. I knew where Clara worked, an up-and-coming art gallery that had recently caught the attention of the city's elite. She had always been proud of her work there. Loved by her colleagues, respected by the circle she ran in, she thought of it as her safe space, her place of power, her sanctuary. That's where I started. I spent time researching her colleagues, the people who she had gotten close to, the ones she had shared her professional life with. It was easy enough to get information from mutual friends, from people I still knew in her circle. Slowly, a picture emerged, a network of relationships, friendships, and hidden tensions. There was one thing I learned that I hadn't anticipated. Clara wasn't as loved as she thought she was. People were aware of her secrets, more than I had expected. It seemed I wasn't the only one who had been hurt by her. I made a phone call, an anonymous tip to one of her colleagues, someone who was ambitious, someone who had been overshadowed by Clara's rise in the art world. The message was simple. Clara was seeing someone else, someone much higher up in the gallery's hierarchy than she had let on, and not just anyone. Someone who was married, someone who had a reputation to protect, the kind of affair that could cost someone their career. The seed was planted, and it didn't take long for the rumors to spread. It wasn't long before Clara's colleagues began to talk, whispering behind her back. Her professional relationships, her status in the gallery began to crumble. Clients began to question her, her peers started to avoid her, and the whispers grew louder. Clara had built her world on a lie, and now that lie was unraveling. But that wasn't enough. I needed her to feel the complete weight of her betrayal. I knew she would try to salvage what was left, to pick up the pieces of her life and pretend she was still in control. So, I took a different approach. I reached out to her new lover, the man who had been at the center of their secret affair. I offered him a deal. I didn't need money or anything material. I didn't even want his loyalty. What I wanted was his guilt, his fear. I wanted him to feel what it was like to live with the consequences of a lie. So I fed him a story about a looming threat, someone from Clara's past who might be looking to expose everything. At first, I wasn't sure if he would bite, but a few days later, Clara's world took another hit. Her lover started distancing himself from her, his phone calls becoming sparse, his excuses piling up. She didn't know it, but I had planted the seed of doubt in his mind. He started pulling away, and soon, Clara was left standing alone. The cold realization that she had lost everything, her career, her relationship, her sense of security, began to sink in. The final move came on. A quiet evening. Clara had decided to confront me. Days passed after Clara's final exit, and as I sat in the silence of my apartment, I realized the revenge I had exacted had left a bitter, lingering taste that refused to fade. It wasn't the satisfaction I had once imagined. There was no triumphant feeling of victory, no sense of rightness that came with watching her unravel. Instead, I felt a strange emptiness, as though the act of retaliation hadn't quite finished its work. I'd watched her fall, seen her lose everything she had carefully built for herself, her career, her lover, her place in the world. Yet it wasn't just the consequences that had caused her to shatter. No, it was something deeper, something far more insidious. The thing I had given her, in all my quiet manipulation, was the slow-burning realization that her actions, her betrayal, had not only damaged me but had altered the very fabric of her own existence. But even with all that, I still couldn't shake the feeling that there was more to be done. A part of me, a part I hated to admit, still wanted to see Clara completely undone. I had made her face the truth, but there was one thing left unfinished, one small yet crucial detail that gnawed at me, and it was that last piece that would truly give me the closure I sought. I hadn't yet reached her new lover, the man she had replaced me with, the one who had slunk into her life when I had been discarded. He was the one who had set all of this in motion, after all. If there was anyone who deserved to feel the full weight of her treachery, it was him. I needed to get to him. The idea of directly confronting him didn't sit well with me. It would be too easy, too confrontational. I needed something subtler, something that would hit him not with the anger of a confrontation, but with the slow realization of just how much he had been deceived. I wanted him to feel like I had, the helplessness of having been made a fool of, the sense of being played and then discarded when you were no longer needed. I began to gather information about him, a man who had been a fixture in Clara's life. For only a few months, he had been a wealthy investor, someone connected to the art world with a reputation to protect. The more I learned about him, the more I realized how easily he could be manipulated. He wasn't the sharpest tool in the shed, and that made him the perfect target for my next move. His office was in the heart of the city, luxurious, sleek, and exactly the kind of place that screamed power. I had a few connections still in the industry, people who knew the ins and outs of high society, and through them, I found my way inside his world. The first step was subtle, a few well-placed rumors, whispers about Clara's past. I didn't need to make him suspicious just yet. I needed to make him curious, so curious that he would feel compelled to dig deeper on his own. I spread the information gently, casually, like seeds scattered in the wind. I didn't just want him to know what had happened with me. I wanted him to see Clara for what she truly was, a woman capable of lying, capable of cheating, capable of betraying the people who trusted her. But that wasn't enough. I had to dig deeper, make the truth more irresistible, more dangerous. So I began to send him small, encrypted messages, each one a puzzle, each one containing a piece of information that painted Clara in a new, darker light. Some were subtle hints about her affair with a married man, others were more direct, such as photos I had taken from her phone, images of her with another man in places she had never mentioned to him. As he pieced it all together, I knew the weight of doubt would begin to settle in. There's a certain type of man, the kind with wealth and influence, who believes in the world as it should be, not as it really is. They trust their instincts, their own authority, their own sense of power. And when that is shattered, when the illusion of control is broken, it can bring them to their knees. I wasn't interested in tearing him apart, not in the way I had with Clara. What I wanted was far more delicate, far more painful. I wanted him to question everything, to second-guess every decision he had ever made, especially his decisions regarding Clara. I wanted him to feel the quiet dread of knowing he had been played like a pawn in a much larger game. The moment came. A few weeks later, when he finally reached out to me, his message terse but unmistakably laced with tension. He had questions. He had heard enough, and now he wanted to know everything. It wasn't the kind of confrontation I had expected, but it was the one I needed. The trap had been set, and he had walked right into it. I agreed to meet him, but I wasn't going to give him the satisfaction of an easy conversation. When we met, I was calm, composed, no trace of the anger I had once felt. I had learned that anger was a tool for the weak. Revenge, true revenge, came from a place of cold precision. The days that followed the meeting with Clara's lover were quieter than I had expected. The chaos I had imagined, the grand unveiling of the truth that would tear them both apart, never really materialized. Instead, everything settled into a tense kind of silence. Clara gone from my life, her lover now tangled in the same lies she had woven, both of them caught in the web of their own deceit. But as the dust settled, I realized something that gnawed at me, something deeper than just the act of revenge itself. It wasn't about the destruction I had caused. It wasn't about the anger that had fueled me in the beginning. No, the emptiness was the true cost of revenge. The emotional wreckage I had left in my wake wasn't the only thing that had changed. I had changed too. The bitterness that once defined me, the hunger for retribution, was starting to fade. It wasn't that I had lost my resolve, or that I was second-guessing the actions I had taken. It was that I had realized something terrifying. Revenge, in the end, doesn't give you back what you lost. It doesn't fill the hollow space that betrayal leaves behind. And even as I watched Clara and her lover struggle with their own guilt, their own unraveling, I couldn't shake the gnawing sense that it wasn't enough. I wanted more. I wanted to feel whole again. But how? A part of me had believed that by ruining their lives, by making them pay for the betrayal, they would somehow repay me for the pain they had caused, that by seeing them broken, by watching them squirm, I would find peace. But peace never came. And the more I thought about it, the more I realized something. Peace wouldn't come from watching them suffer. It would come from finding a way to release the anger, to release the pain, to finally break free of the cycle of vengeance I had allowed myself to become trapped in. I spent the next few weeks in quiet reflection, trying to pull myself out of the haze that had clouded my judgment for so long. I began to focus on the parts of myself that had been lost during this pursuit of revenge, the parts that had been buried under layers of hurt and anger. I started to reconnect with things I had abandoned, my hobbies, my passions, the parts of myself that had been neglected in the chaos of my past relationships. It wasn't easy. It felt like pulling a thorn out of a wound. But the more I worked at it, the clearer my mind became. One evening, as I sat on my couch with a glass of wine in hand, I received a message, a simple text that made my heart skip a beat. It was from Clara. "I need to talk to you. Please." At first I was frozen. A part of me, an old, familiar part, wanted to ignore it, to let her stew in the mess she had created. But something inside me stirred, an unsettling curiosity. What did she want? What could she possibly have to say to me after everything that had happened? Against my better judgment, I agreed to meet her. This time, though, it was different. I wasn't the same person who had once been so desperate for closure. I wasn't the same person driven by a need to tear her apart. I didn't know what I wanted from this meeting, but I knew one thing. It wouldn't be about revenge. We met at a small cafe, a quiet place we had often gone to when things were still good between us. It felt strange to be sitting across from her again, the same woman who had once meant everything to me, now sitting there with an air of vulnerability I hadn't seen in her before. Clara looked different. Her usual air of confidence was gone, replaced by something raw, something that almost resembled guilt. Her eyes were tired, heavy with the weight of everything that had happened. "I don't expect you to forgive me," she started, her voice quieter than I had ever heard it. I wanted to apologize. I wanted you to know that what I did to you, it was wrong." I studied her for a moment, taking in her words, her demeanor. There was no anger in me now. No need to make her suffer the way I had once felt. Just exhaustion. I had already seen her world fall apart. What more could I do to her? "I know I can't undo the past," she continued, "but I want you to know that I've changed. I've lost everything. The man I thought I could be with, my career, my sense of self, and I'm not asking for your forgiveness. I'm not even asking for your understanding. I'm just asking that you know I never meant to hurt you like this. It's been eating at me every day. I watched her, and for the first time in so long, I didn't see her as the woman who had betrayed me. I saw someone who had been broken by her own choices, someone who had lost herself in a spiral of lies and deceit. It wasn't an excuse. It didn't make everything she had done okay. But there, in that moment, I realized that revenge hadn't brought me peace. It had only kept me tied to the past. "I've been holding on to my anger for so long," I said, my voice steady but soft. The weeks after that encounter with Clara were strange, filled with a sense of quiet clarity I hadn't anticipated. The anger, once so blinding, had faded into the background, leaving room for reflection. I thought I had finally achieved peace, after letting go of my quest for vengeance, but even in that newfound stillness, there lingered something I couldn't quite shake, a sense of unfinished business. The truth was, revenge hadn't satisfied me in the way I thought it would. Exposing Clara, orchestrating the unraveling of her world, had been exhilarating in the moment, but it had also left me feeling hollow. There was no great victory in her collapse, no sense of justice that had filled the void she'd left behind. It hadn't healed the wound. It had only deepened it. But then, as I began to move on with my life, something unexpected happened. It was late one evening when I received an email. The subject line was simple: "We need to talk." It was from Clara's lover, the man who had been the catalyst for all the chaos. The man I had made sure would feel the sting of betrayal just as I had. A cold wave of anticipation washed over me. What could he possibly want now? The last time we had spoken, I had made sure to leave him with nothing but doubt and regret. I had planted the seeds, let him stew in his guilt. So why was he reaching out? What did he want from me? I hesitated for a long moment before opening the message. It was short, too short, as though he had been struggling to find the right words. "I'm sorry," it began. "I never wanted to be a part of all of this. I've made terrible mistakes, and I need to face them. Can we meet? Please." I sat back in my chair, the weight of his words sinking in. My first instinct was to ignore him. What could he possibly offer that would change anything? But a strange curiosity tugged at me. In the end, wasn't this what I had wanted all along? To make them realize the depth of their wrongs, to have them confront what they had done? Without thinking too much about it, I agreed to meet him. I suggested a quiet bar on the edge of the city, a place where no one would recognize us, where no one would overhear our conversation. When I arrived, he was already there, sitting at a booth in the back, looking out of place in the dimly lit setting. His shoulders were hunched, his eyes not quite meeting mine as I walked in. He looked older than I remembered, more worn down as though the weight of everything had settled into his bones. I took a seat across from him, watching his face closely. He didn't look like the man I had known through Clara. Confident, controlled, entitled. Now he looked like someone who had been beaten down by his own choices. "I don't even know where to begin," he said, his voice strained. "You were right. You were right about everything." I wasn't sure what to say. Part of me wanted to gloat, to revel in the satisfaction of seeing him broken. After all, this was the man who had once been so sure of himself, so sure that Clara was the woman he had been waiting for. But in this moment, I wasn't sure that was what I needed. Instead, I leaned forward slightly, eyes cold but not unkind. "What exactly are you sorry for?" He sighed, running a hand through his hair. "I'm sorry for the way I treated you, for what I did to her, to you. You warned me, but I didn't listen. I was blinded by my own pride. I let her pull me into something I shouldn't have been a part of, and now I've lost everything." There was a long pause as he stared down at the table. It was as though he was trying to find some way to make up for what he had done, but words seemed insufficient. What did a few apologies matter when the damage had already been done? "You didn't just lose everything because of her. I said, my voice quiet. You lost everything because you couldn't see past your own desires. You thought you could play a part in this twisted little drama she created, and now you're paying the price. He nodded slowly, as if accepting the truth of my words. I was selfish, he muttered, and I thought I could get away with it. But I didn't realize how much it would hurt everyone, including me. A part of me felt vindicated by his acknowledgement, but another part of me wondered, what was the point of all of this? What did I truly want from him? Had I been waiting for an apology? For some kind of redemption? For him to offer me something that would make the pain of betrayal disappear? The answer came slowly, a realization that struck with quiet intensity. I didn't need his apology. I didn't need anything from him at all. My revenge had been the end of the story, not the beginning. I stared at him for a long time before speaking again. You can keep apologizing all you want, but it won't change anything. What's done is done, and no amount of regret is going to fix that. He looked up at me, his eyes filled with something close to desperation. I know I can't fix it, but I can. The weeks that followed my final encounter with Clara's lover were a strange mixture of peace and lingering unease. I had told myself I was done, that I had reached the end of the path I had walked for so long, the path of revenge, of betrayal, of hurt. But the truth was, the battle within me wasn't over. Not quite. The clarity I had found, the catharsis of confronting him, had left a strange hollow feeling in its wake. I had no more enemies to face. Clara was gone, her lover was broken, and yet something about the emptiness felt like a wound I hadn't quite healed. I began to realize that revenge, no matter how meticulously executed, never truly heals the damage of betrayal. It had only given me a temporary sense of control, a momentary satisfaction, but that fleeting victory hadn't filled the void. Days passed, and I tried to move forward. I threw myself into my work, into quiet distractions, anything to avoid, confronting the lingering ache inside. But no matter how many books I read, how many nights I spent staring at my computer screen, there was always a voice in the back of my head, a voice that whispered of what was left undone. Clara. I had watched her crumble. Her world had fallen apart, as had his. But I couldn't help but wonder, had they truly learned their lesson? Had they felt the weight of their betrayal the way I had felt it? Or had they simply retreated into their own lives, leaving the past to rot in the shadows? I couldn't let it go. One evening, while I was reviewing a report at my desk, an email notification popped up. It was from Clara. At first, my heart skipped a beat, but I quickly dismissed it. What could she possibly have to say now? Another apology? Another empty plea for forgiveness? I ignored it, but the curiosity gnawed at me. I opened the email. It was short. Too short. I've made a huge mistake, it read. I need to see you. Please. Can we meet? For a moment, I was paralyzed. Could this be real? Did she want to apologize, or was this another attempt to manipulate me, to pull me back into the web she had spun? After all, hadn't I already seen her true face? She had betrayed me in the most devastating way possible. What could she want? Now? But there was something in the words, a hint of vulnerability, of desperation, that pulled me in. I had to know what she wanted. I had to hear it from her lips. I agreed to meet her. The location was set. An old cafe we used to frequent. One of the few places where we shared moments of peace before everything fell apart. When I arrived, I could see her from across the room. Clara. She looked different. The confidence she once wore like armor had faded, replaced by something raw. Her eyes were hollow, as though the weight of the past few months had drained every bit of life from her. She was sitting by the window, staring out into the night, lost in thought. When she saw me, there was a flicker of recognition, but also a trace of fear. I sat down across from her, the silence hanging thick between us. "I didn't know what I was doing," she said quietly, her voice trembling as though the words were difficult to force out. "I thought I was in control, but I was just running from everything, from the life I had with you, from the truth, from myself." I stayed silent, watching her, waiting for her to continue. Part of me wanted to lash out, to remind her of the pain she had caused, but I knew better now. I had learned that silence could be more powerful than any accusation. "I never wanted to hurt you," she went on, her eyes welling up. "And I can't take back what I did. I know that. But I need you to understand something. The affair, everything, it was never about you. It was about me. It was about my own insecurities, my own fear. I wanted to feel wanted again, and I was willing to destroy everything to get it." I could see the honesty in her eyes. She wasn't trying to manipulate me this time. She was broken. And it wasn't just from the consequences of her actions. It was from the fact that she had finally come face to face with the truth of her choices, the truth of what she had lost. "I thought you would just forgive me," she whispered, almost as if speaking to herself. "I thought I could leave everything behind and start fresh, but now I see the damage I've done, not just to you, to myself, to him. I've ruined everything." I studied her for a long moment. I could feel the temptation to rise, to walk away, to leave her here with her regrets. But instead I found myself speaking, my voice low and calm. "You've ruined more than just your life," I said. "You've ruined everything we had. The trust, the love. You can't just apologize for that. It doesn't work like that." Her face crumpled with the weight of my words, and I almost regretted speaking them. But she needed to hear it. She needed to know that the damage wasn't something she could undo with a few words. "I know," she said. "Tears, I know it's too—" The days after my last meeting with Clara were filled with a strange kind of quiet. The world seemed to continue around me, indifferent to the battle I had fought in my own heart. For a while, I wondered if I had truly found peace, or if I was simply living in the aftermath of all the pain, pretending it didn't matter anymore. But the truth lingered, buried beneath my attempts at moving on. There was no such thing as a clean break from betrayal. I thought I was done with revenge. After all, what had it truly brought me? A fleeting sense of satisfaction, the briefest, of moments where I felt the weight of power in my hands, watching as Clara and her lover both crumbled under the weight of their lies. But soon, that satisfaction turned bitter. Like a drug that no longer numbed the pain but left a deeper emptiness in its wake, the pursuit of vengeance had lost its appeal. Yet, as the days turned to weeks, something else began to eat away at me, a lingering sense that I hadn't truly finished the story. It wasn't enough to simply have watched them suffer. There was still a loose thread that needed to be tied. A part of me knew it was unhealthy, but another part of me couldn't shake the feeling that there was one more thing I had to do. It wasn't about revenge anymore. It wasn't about punishment. It was about justice, a reckoning that they couldn't escape. I wasn't content with the vague notion of them learning their lesson. I wanted them to understand the full extent of the damage they had caused, to comprehend just how far their betrayal had reached. But this wasn't a plan for destruction. It was a final reckoning. And the next part of the story, the true end, would take an unexpected turn. One evening, an unexpected visitor showed up at my door. It was her lover, the man I had ruined, the man who had been a pawn in Clara's twisted game. I had expected to never see him again, and yet here he was, standing on my doorstep with a look of determination that I had never seen before. "I know what you're doing," he said, his voice low but steady. I froze, unsure of how to react. Was he here to threaten me, to accuse me of something, or was he trying to salvage whatever was left of his own dignity? He held up a small envelope. I know what you did to me, to Clara, to both of us. But I've realized something. It's not enough for you to see us suffer. You want more, don't you?" I stared at him, realizing in that moment that this encounter wasn't about confrontation. It wasn't about the chaos of revenge. It was about something much more complicated, a shared understanding that we had both been pawns in a game much larger than we could have imagined. "You're right," I said slowly, my voice not as strong as I expected. "I wanted justice. But what does that even mean now?" He handed me the envelope without a word, his eyes hard, his jaw clenched. I took it from him, feeling a strange shift in the air. Opening it, I found a letter inside, a confession of sorts, but not from Clara, from him. "I've wronged you more than I can say," it began. "I've deceived you, used you, and played a part in ruining the only good thing I had in my life. But there's one thing I've learned. The only way to heal is to stop pretending we can undo what's been done. I've been part of something bigger, something that led us all here." The letter went on to describe how their affair had been, orchestrated not just out of lust or desire, but because of external pressures. Clara had been drawn into it, not by her own shortcomings, but by someone else. Someone from her past, who had been controlling her every move. "I was a fool to believe this was about me," he wrote. "But the truth is, we were both caught in a web we didn't understand. I thought I could break free, but I only made it worse." My heart pounded in my chest. It wasn't just an apology. It was a revelation. This wasn't just about betrayal. It was about manipulation on a level I hadn't anticipated. Someone had played the strings from behind the scenes, pushing Clara into the arms of her lover, pushing both of them into a spiral of self-destruction. The name at the bottom of the letter was familiar, but not in a way I had expected. It was someone from Clara's past, someone I knew only vaguely, but whose influence had always seemed far too strong. I had dismissed them for years as an unimportant figure, someone who had no real hold over Clara. But I was wrong. They had been the puppet master, and we had all been mere marionettes. The revelation hit me like a flood. Everything I had thought I knew about Clara's betrayal suddenly seemed like a faint echo. The affair wasn't just about her desire for excitement or her dissatisfaction with our life. It was a symptom of something much darker, something much more dangerous. I looked up at Clara's lover, my mind racing. "So you're telling me this wasn't just about us?" I asked, trying to make sense of it all. He nodded grimly. "Exactly. The moment I realized that the true mastermind of the betrayal wasn't Clara or her lover, but someone else, someone whose influence had quietly seeped into every corner of their lives, I felt an unsettling mixture of rage and determination. The world around me shifted in ways I hadn't anticipated, as though the floor beneath me had cracked open, revealing a deeper, more dangerous reality than I could have imagined. This wasn't just about broken trust anymore. This wasn't just about Clara's lies or the web of deceit we had all gotten tangled in. This was about power, manipulation, a force that had orchestrated everything from the shadows, shaping the lives of those around me like mere chess pieces. The letter from Clara's lover had revealed something that was both horrifying and eye-opening. The person responsible for everything was someone from Clara's past, someone who had maintained an iron grip on her life without me ever knowing it. I thought back to all the years I'd spent with Clara, how there had always been moments, little things that didn't add up. The way she would vanish for days, the way she became distant, the way she seemed to withdraw into herself at times only to return with a hollow smile. But I had never questioned it. I had never dared to. Now, though, it was clear. The true puppet master had been hiding in plain sight. Someone I could never have predicted. Someone who, for years, had played the game of manipulation with masterful precision. I stood there, staring at the letter as the realization began to settle in. The name at the bottom of the letter made my blood run cold. Marcus Bennett. I didn't recognize the name at first, but the more I thought about it, the more it started to make sense. He had been a shadow in Clara's past, someone she had always spoken of vaguely, as if she was trying to shield me from the reality of their relationship. He was a figure who had come into her life long before I had, and from what I knew, he was someone with a great deal of power in certain circles. A businessman, well-connected, influential, and perhaps most importantly, dangerous. I felt a wave of unease flood through me. This was no longer about infidelity. It wasn't just about Clara's betrayal. It was about a person who had been playing a much larger game, manipulating lives for his own benefit. The thought made my stomach churn. I turned to Clara's lover, who stood waiting patiently, his expression unreadable. His words echoed in my mind. We were all being used. The person who started all of this, she's the one who needs to be stopped. Not me, not Clara, her. For the first time in what felt like an eternity, I understood. This wasn't the ending I had imagined. There would be no grand revenge, no ultimate punishment for Clara or her lover. The true enemy was far more insidious, and my revenge, my reckoning, had to be directed at Marcus Bennett. I needed to know everything about him. Over the next several weeks, I began digging into Marcus's life. I followed every lead, every shadowy corner of his past. I found out more than I wanted to know. About his ruthless business dealings, about the people who feared him, about the relationships he had cultivated and destroyed. It wasn't just power that he craved. It was control over everything and everyone in his orbit. And then I discovered the part that sent a chill down my spine. Marcus had been connected to some of the most high-stakes, dangerous dealings in the city, and not just business deals. He was tied to a network of people, criminals, shady operatives, powerful players in both the legal and underworld. He had orchestrated things from the background, manipulating people like pawns in a chess game. Clara had been one of those pawns, and so had I. As I dug deeper, I uncovered disturbing evidence, documents, photos, recordings that painted a chilling portrait of the web Marcus had woven. But most disturbing of all was the realization that Clara had been involved in it, at least indirectly. She had been his tool, his victim, and ultimately his accomplice, although she never fully realized how deeply she was entangled in his schemes. I had thought my anger and desire for revenge were about the betrayal itself, about Clara's affair. But now, as I stood over the evidence, I realized the true cost of my pain. It wasn't just a broken heart or shattered trust. It was the lives that had been torn apart for something much darker, for control, for manipulation. I had to confront Marcus. I had to make him understand that his reign of secrecy and power over people's lives would end with me. I wasn't sure how to approach it. I wasn't even sure I could confront him directly. He was too powerful, too dangerous. But I had learned enough to know that I could not wait any longer. I devised a plan, not one of open confrontation, but of calculated exposure. If Marcus had built his empire of lies and control, then I would destroy it with the truth.